Hello and welcome to Chapter 1 of Crisis Intervention. This first chapter we will be covering some foundational concepts. To begin with, we need to define what a crisis is and what crisis intervention is. Typically, when people think of a crisis, they think of some of the bigger than life events that we see on television or have experienced face to face. Twin Towers, school shootings, natural disasters. Um, But it's not just the precipitating event that figures into the definition. Probably the bigger piece when it comes to the human condition is the perception of the event as threatening or damaging. So it is not the event specifically that is the major cause of the crisis, rather the perception of that event that can play a huge role. So like we all think about Katrina or this tsunami off Thailand, um, the thing that causes problems with emotional distress, leading to coping skill problems and an impairment in functioning, is the perception of the event. The perception is the meaning that we attribute to the event, and this can be different for each person. So, as far as a formula to understand how the process works, there's the event, the perception of the event, which can result in emotional distress and therefore lowered functioning when coping fails. Now, coping is one of these terms where you can have coping mechanisms that are not good for you, but you can also have what we call adaptive coping mechanisms. So there are maladaptive and adaptive coping mechanisms. Now, what is the formula for increasing functioning? How are we trying to improve people? Really by looking at changing the perception of the event and helping them to acquire new coping skills. With the focus of both of these, what you are likely to see is a decrease in emotional distress and increase in functioning. When we get back to this idea of perception, it's this simple. Father throws his child in the air, has joy, doesn't think it's that high up in the air. The kid thinks it's pretty high, but the mom from far away maybe causes more anxiety in her and sees it a little bit differently in terms of the risk. Crisis is also considered both an opportunity as well as risk or danger. Uh, it's an opportunity in that with help we can develop better insight, coping, growth, and hopefully some inoculation against future stresses or crises. Of course, the danger involved is that when someone doesn't have any help or assistance, that there are a lot of outcomes that are not very favorable. So, in order to talk a little bit about, I'm going to build up to this concept of what we call a crisis prone person, but to do that, we have to talk a little bit about the ego. Now, there's not a lot about the ego that's going to be on a quiz or a test, but I want to give you a little bit of background when we're talking about ego strength because it does relate to coping. So, how we protect ourselves psychologically from anxiety or external events causing anxiety is we rely on aspects of the ego that help reduce our anxiety. So there are a lot of ways that we do this. We can file a lot of these under the category of defense mechanisms. So those can involve denying things or changing how you perceive reality. But there are other defense mechanisms too that are a little bit more silver lining than this definition. So we use the ego to resolve internal anxieties. We use it to control internal impulses of the id, to compare what the external realities are versus our internal fears. For example, your boss comes in and says you did a crap job. Your id or your internal impulse might be to punch that person in the face. However, you understand that in order to have groceries and a place to live, you need a job. So you're weighing these external realities against the internal desires. There are a number of defense mechanisms. Again, not on a quiz, but just for your general knowledge as you work in the field. And these aren't all negative things. I mean, we can categorize them under early developmental defense mechanisms, like if you think about a toddler who has a tantrum on the ground, that's a way of coping, to an adult who may use a more mature way to deal with it. For example, maybe someone who's generally angry or aggressive becoming a professional football player. So now they're using these internal impulses in a more socially acceptable way. So the crisis prone person tends to use ego strength to become defensive rather than managing the reality around them. And I'm sure you've seen this with a lot of politicians in particular who get caught up doing stuff and the denials that go along with it. That you'll sit and watch the TV and you'll say, no, I don't think so. These folks may be unprepared to manage future stresses. They may enter crisis states more frequently. I'm not talking about politicians, although that's the case. I'm talking about people who are more crisis prone. They engage and maybe continue to get into abusive relationships, even knowing the possible outcome of them, or even just outright denial of the outcome of them. And oftentimes, if you've had a course in psychology, you're familiar with what we call the personality disorders, and those are folks who you can often see sort of this crisis-prone character. I referred a little bit earlier, again, not on the quiz, but something you should be aware of when you're working with people about the maturity or lack thereof of defense mechanisms. So, for example, if you're in a review with your supervisor and and you run into the corner because you don't like the review and you start crying and sucking your thumb, that is what we call regression. You're going back to an earlier stage of development in order to try to cope with something. Now, it's primitive because that's not how adults should operate, right? A more defense mechanism might be something like anticipation, like you're anticipating that your supervisor may say something like that, so maybe you start preparing for it so you have some answers for the questions that they bring up, or you see an uptick in some of the work that you know that you haven't been that great in. There are other determinants to this, of course, material resources, what you have access to in terms of money, for example, personal resources, who you those things that you have internally to cope with things, as well as social resources. Who are the people around you that can be helpful in times of crisis? There are different kinds of crisis as well. There are developmental crises, which are sort of normal transitional phases. Adolescence brings to mind a lot of normal developmental crises that occur. For example, trying to figure out who you are in life. Versus situational crises, which are like these unexpected, sudden emergencies that we can't predict. Perception, again, going back to that, how we attribute meaning to things is key to both. And also understand that crisis is different than stress. Uh, Primarily because in stress, people can generally function and cope, whereas in a crisis, there is an incredible burden on the coping skills, coping abilities of the individual. Another thing when we're talking about crisis intervention is to think about degree of anxiety, right? So let's say there's a test that's coming up in this class. If you are not anxious about it, you're not worried about it, you're probably not really going to study for it. You're probably not really going to look at a book. You're going to be like, this Seth dude, this is cake, no problem. A moderate degree of anxiety might be more like, I should probably at least read the chapter, maybe some of the concepts to get a decent grade. So there's some degree of anxiety in you forcing you to prepare to be ready. Whereas folks who have really high anxiety become overwhelmed. They may shut down, run away, and sometimes those folks, when it's high anxiety and can't be coped with, you may not be able to see a change in their behavior unless there's some sort of medication intervention, perhaps. We're going to talk a little bit about Eric Lindemann, who together with Gerald Kaplan came up with some interesting ideas from the Wellesley Project. But Lindemann started working with grief reactions from those survivors of the Coconut Grove fire, which is, there's a 10-minute clip on it in this unit, and you'll get to see a little bit about what that was like. The reason that we have Coconut Grove in there is because you can see a lot of survivors talking about their reactions to it, especially kind of like looking back on it now so many years later. It's kind of interesting. So Lindemann was doing grief work and connected around 19 in the mid 1940s with Gerald Kaplan, and together they started the Wellesley Project, which primarily focused on women dealing with grief due to lost or deformed births from thiolamide. Thiolamide was a medication that was given to pregnant women for morning sickness, and what was happening is that there were children dying as a result, and children being born with birth defects. Um, so there was a lot of grief work that was going on, a lot of sort of what we call preventive psychiatry, trying to intervene earlier. And some of the things that came out of the Wellesley Project, the reason that these are important is because these coping behaviors is because the people that you will be working with, you will either see one of these coping behaviors or you will be trying to develop one of these coping behaviors, one or more. So, for example, those who came out of the grief work in a better, more productive way were more able to explore reality, express feelings, seek help from others, look at problems in a piece by piece approach rather than being overwhelmed by it. They were aware of their fatigue. They could function in certain capacities. They were adaptive in their thinking. They were flexible and willing to change, as well as trusting in others and having some sense of optimism. So those are things you're going to either look for or be working on when you're working with clients in a crisis situation. That is the end of part one. Part two is right around the corner.